Yes, the Bible has contradictions, and inside of this conversation, I'm going to tell you what a few of them are, and also how we as Christians or just Bible studiers or people that are just curious can truly navigate through them. By the end of this video, I really want us to really understand the nature of the Bible as a literary collection. I also want us to look at the Bible inside of its, historical canonization, how it was actually put together. And then I'm hoping that we'll be able to critically engage with apparent contradictions. We are not going to be looking at this from a spiritual perspective, trying to drop God inside of, the text. No, we're going to look at the Bible as a literary piece of work. And we're going to look at the apparent contradictions that are located inside of the conglomerate text that was put together and canonized as the Bible. Okay. By the end of our conversation, I'm hoping that we'll be able to approach biblical study in a way that is intellectually honest, but then also gives us a level of nuanced perspective. All right. The first thing that I really want us to point out is that the Bible is a literary collection. All right. Now, the Bible, yes, it is often considered to be the inspired word of God, most definitely. But when we look at its formation, we cannot negate the fact that it is also a collection of literary works. It's a collection of poetry. It's a collection of history. It is a collection of law. It is a collection of prophecy. It is a collection of wisdom literature. It is a collection of letters. And all of these documents were written over centuries, hundreds of years by multiple authors. All right. This diversity naturally leads to differences in perspective, differences in emphasis, differences in audience, and sometimes what appears to be contradictions. And that's really what we're going to delve into today. But before we get there, there are a couple of key considerations that I want us to delve into when studying the Bible. The first is historical context. All right. We have to understand that the books of the Bible were written in different times, in different places, by different different authors, and then also inside of different cultural settings. All right. The second thing that I really want us to consider is authorship. All right. Some books have multiple contributors and even later additions outside of what the original author could have wrote. All right. I also want us to look at translation issues. All right. Because we all know language interprets things differently as it goes from language to language. And there are language differences between Hebrew, between Aramaic, between Greek, and even, modern day English, Spanish, Mandarin, whatever, translation the Bible has been translated into. Guess what? There are some translation issues. Let's just not negate that fact. And then the last consideration I want us to look at, number 4, is theological intentions. All right. Because authors wrote with specific audiences and religious purposes in mind. All right. So I'm encouraging that inside of our conversation today that we take a critical thinking approach, understanding that taking this approach, it does not seek to discredit the Bible, but rather it's going to allow us to engage with it honestly, acknowledging that, yes, the Bible is very, very complex and we are just seeking further meaning inside of it. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Okay. So first I want to do a brief history of biblical canonization, or the formation of the Bible. I want us to acknowledge the fact that the Bible did not just fall from the sky inside of its current form. No, it was compiled, it was edited, it was standardized over centuries with different traditions emphasizing different texts. So let's look at the Old Testament and the New Testament and how they were canonized. The Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, was largely finalized around 2nd century BCE through different Jewish sects and had various interpretations of it. Okay. I plan on doing a conversation on the Dead Sea Scrolls and how this was just another discovery of one Jewish sect, one community of Jews who had a text, and how it completely changed how we have, or what we have as the current Bible today. Okay. So I just want to kind of point out, I know I'm kind of, backtracking or going inside of a different direction, but I want us to point out that inside of Jewish tradition, there were multiple families of Jews. There were multiple sects of Jews. Like, it was not this, big universal faith where one tribe could talk to another tribe. No, you had multiple communities of Jews that all had their own variations of texts and stories. Okay. We also have the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which included books that later became a part of the Catholic and Orthodox Deuteronomical book, or the Apocrypha. All right. Then we move to the New Testament with regards to its canonization. The early church circulated various gospels, circulated various letters, and then also circulated various apocalyptic texts. After Jesus' death, there were so many writings that were going around. It was not until the canonization, or the formation process, began in the 2nd century CE. And by 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria listed the 27 books that we now recognize as the New Testament. All right. It was not until 30 years later that the Council of Carthage affirmed this list, though debates continued about these final 27 books that made it inside of the Bible as the New Testament. Now, I have to point out with the formation of the Bible that, yes, there are omissions and edits. Okay. Certain texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, were excluded for theological or political reasons. I do a whole conversation on that. I want you to go and find it inside of my library. But I do a whole conversation on what if the Gospel of Thomas, what if the Gospel of Mary had been included inside of the Bible? What would Christianity look like today? I can almost guarantee you it will look very different to the religion that we have today. All right. So we have those omissions. Those are just two of the various quote unquote lost books of the Bible. That's a whole nother conversation. But then we also have various edits that took place inside of the Bible's formation. Some books, like the book of Mark, it originally ended abruptly at Mark, the 16th chapter and the 8th verse. It just stopped. Like, nobody knows. It just stopped. But later manuscripts added verses. So Mark 16 verse 9 through 20, in order to harmonize with resurrection narratives, in order to make it kind of fit within the narrative of the other gospels. All right. This history, and it's all inside of history, this history, as far as the formation of the Bible, reveals that the Bible, as we have it today, underwent selection and revision until it became the final document that we have today. And we should encourage ourselves to engage with the Bible with intellectual curiosity because of this. All right. So I want to point out 5 of the top biblical contradictions. Again, there are so many inside the Bible, but I just want to point out 5 and just kind of give a couple of things on how we can, for lack of better words, use these in order to help us deepen our study. All right. Because while many contradictions can be reconciled through deeper study, others still remain a point of debate. And here are 5 that I'm just going to give. Again, I can't give all of them. I'm just going to give 5 examples that illustrate challenges inside of interpretation. The first one is the creation story. Is there one account or are there 2 accounts? I do a full lecture on this with regards to creationism. The 2 verses that are up against each other are Genesis 1:1 versus Genesis 2:3. And then you have Genesis 2 verses 4 through 25. which almost suggests that there were two different creation stories. Why? And this is just one of the reasons. I can literally name about 20 of them. But again, that's inside of my other lecture. Genesis 1, creation occurs in 6 days, with humans, male and female, being created together and being created last. Inside of Genesis chapter 2, the creation of Adam, male, appears before plants and animals first, and it's more of a narrative, and Eve is then formed out of Adam's rib. So here's where the quandary comes about as far as some questions that we can ask. Are these two distinct traditions that have been edited together? Or is one a theological narrative and the other a detailed sequence? This is still up for debate. Another contradiction that's up for debate is, how did Judas die? Yeah, the disciple that betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. How did he die? The two scriptures in question are Matthew 27, 3 through 5, versus Acts 1 and 18. Matthew 27 says that Judas hanged himself after returning the betrayal money. Acts 1 says that Judas fell headlong, his body bursting open after purchasing a field. Which one was it? The two possible two possible explanations is that there were two different traditions, two different sects, two different people or communities that had two different stories regarding Judas's fate. Some suggest that he hanged himself and then after hanging himself later fell. But the texts present very, very distinct deaths. Okay. Another contradiction that some people look at is, who killed Goliath? Yeah. The whole story of David and Goliath. Who killed Goliath? 1 Samuel 17, 49 through 50 versus 2 Samuel 21 and 19. Inside of 1 Samuel 17, David kills Goliath with a slingshot and later beheads him. In 2 Samuel 21, verse 19, Elhanan kills Goliath, the Gittite. Here are the interpretation challenges, all right? Because some argue copyist errors, or that Elhanan killed Goliath's brother, and then this was added inside of later translations. Others suggest that there are just multiple traditions, multiple accounts about Goliath's death, and nobody really knows. Okay, maybe David did kill him after hitting him inside the head with a rock. Maybe he went inside of a concussion or a coma, and then somebody else finished him off. I don't know, but the Bible is not clear, because it gives us this contradiction. Another contradiction that is typically up for debate is answering the question, can God be seen? Okay. And there are actually 3 verses at odds with this. You have Exodus 33 and 20. You have Genesis 32 and 30. And then you have Judges 13 and 22. Exodus 33 and 20 says, you cannot see my face. This is God speaking. You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Genesis 32 and 30, Jacob says, I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Judges 13:22, Manoah fears death because he saw God. So there are some interpretation considerations here. Are these metaphorical with regards to its outcome, or are these literal encounters? And then also, do these reflect different theological perspectives within the Hebrew tradition? In other words, do some traditions say that we ought to try to seek the face of God? And do other traditions say that, we should leave God alone and God is aloof and we should not be seeking the face of God? Okay. And then the last one, again, this is just, what I'm pulling out today. But again, there are tons that are out there. This whole notion of salvation. All right. Do we get saved? Is salvation by faith or is it by works? A lot of my scholarly colleagues are going to be a little mad at me for bringing this about, because this is one of the things that we talk about inside of getting seminary degrees and master's degrees. It's always brought up in conversation, are we saved by our faith or are we saved by our works? And it's because of these two specific scriptures. Romans 3:28 versus James 2:24. Romans 3:28 says, a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. James 2:24 says, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now, again, there is a huge debate amongst scholars, because clearly Paul and James, the author of these two texts, appear to disagree on salvation. And this leads to theological disputes, even inside of our churches today. Is it just faith that's going to get you into heaven? Or do you need to actually work some things out in order for you to get into heaven? Now, some argue that both were just giving critiques of the other. In other words, some argue that James is critiquing an empty faith. Okay? And others say that Paul is critiquing individuals who are trying to rely on Jewish law in order to get them into heaven or in order to get them saved. There are some critical thinking questions that I really want us to think about. Can these perspectives be harmonized? Can it be faith and works, or does it have to be one or the other? Or do they reflect distinct Christian theologies and understandings of God? Because as we can see, with all the various denominations that we have inside of Christianity, I mean, you've got the Baptists, the Methodists, the Catholics, the Protestants, you got the Pentecostals, you got Church of God in Christ, you got the United Methodists, you got the African Methodist Episcopal, you got the Methodist Episcopal. I mean, everybody has their own theology on salvation and how faith exercises itself and how works comes out inside of this process of salvation. But can we harmonize the two? And then also I want us to think, how do different Christian traditions interpret salvation? I mean, do your own research. Look it up on how various, although they all say that they are Christian, how they all view salvation extremely differently. All right. So there are four takeaways that I really want us to think about as we're ending today's conversation. The first one is that the Bible is a diverse collection of texts. It is not a single uniform narrative. All right. I want us to note that nobody sat down and went from Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation and wrote it inside of that sequential order. No. The Bible is very diverse. Like I said in the very beginning, there's history, there's poetry, there's law, there's prophecy, there's apocalyptic writings, there's letters. It is a collection. The Bible is a diverse collection of text. What we have in front of us, yes, it is formatted inside of a single book, but the truth is that it is a collection of text. All right. The second thing is that the canonization process, or the formation of the Bible, involved choices about which books to include and how to interpret them. There are so many, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but I've always said this inside of the class setting. I do not believe that the Bible should have been closed. There was actually a scripture added in the book of Revelation as they were finishing up their debates and as they were finishing up all their meetings and as they were finishing up all their councils, that said, look, we don't want to do this again. And they put inside of the Bible that you shall not neither change or add or take away from this, otherwise your name will be changed and deleted from heaven, da 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 da. That was man put inside. Now, some would say that it was God ordained or God inspired or whatnot, but I believe that there are so many different texts, that there are so many different writings that have been divinely inspired that we should utilize as biblical reference, as religious reference. You cannot tell me that God stopped talking to people, that God stopped speaking to individuals, that God stopped telling people to write stuff down just because a group of men got together and said, we're done debating what books are going to be added and how they're going to be interpreted. So this is it. No, I don't believe that. All right. And you can agree with me or disagree with me. Put it inside the comments. Let me know what you think. Do you think that the Bible should have been left open, that we should reopen the text and maybe add more stuff to it over the course of the years that we've discovered since its official canonization of what we have today? Again, that's a whole nother debate. All right. The third thing is that there are apparent contradictions inside of the Bible. However, they do not necessarily invalidate the Bible. But in my opinion, they invite us to do just like what we've done today, and that is engage critically with the text. We cannot just look at it for face value. Another big contradiction: the Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not kill," but then the poetic writings over inside the book of Ecclesiastes says that there's a time to kill. Which one is it? Let's have some critical engagement with it. It's not invalidating when we find these contradictions. It does not invalidate the Bible. No. It just gives us an opportunity to engage with the text inside of an intellectual, critical thinking perspective. All right. And then the last thing is that biblical interpretation has been influenced by history, by theology, and also by cultural context. History definitely has had a huge impact. What was going on inside of the time in which the Bible was being structured and what was going on inside of the time in which even these books were being written has a huge influence. Theology, how people understand God. Listen, the way how people understood God back inside of the days of Moses and Noah were not the same as how people understood God inside of the days of David and Saul. And it's still not the same how people understand God inside of the days of Jesus or inside of the days of Paul or even inside of the days of now. And we have to take that inside into consideration. And then we also have the cultural context. Because like I said earlier, the Bible and these texts were written for specific people at a specific time for a specific purpose inside of a specific environment. There are some things that the Bible references that are not happening today. So in my opinion, we can learn from them, but to read them inside of a literal stance would be dumb because they're just not happening today. Okay. So my final question as we're ending today's conversation, I hope that this has been enjoyable. How do you believe that we should approach biblical contradictions? Should we approach them as errors in the Bible? Should we approach them as theological tensions inside the Bible? Or should we approach them as evidence that the Bible's human and divine nature is very, very complex, but worth looking into? Thank you for joining me at my desk. I hope that this information has been informative.